And so the next section I do just want to touch upon briefly is you have to utilize a stitch line within your Illustrator flats. So of course, you're probably familiar from hand drawing that you often, it's a requirement and necessary for your design to be clear and finished correctly to draw every stitch or do every little stitch line utilizing a very fine pen. Same principle applies to Adobe Illustrator, but it's a little bit quicker. This is one of several reasons why I personally prefer Illustrator for my flats. It makes it very, very easy to utilize something like a stitch line, and that can be any type of stitch, really. You can create what we call a brush, which you'll find out more about later on, to show couch stitching, or a baby hem, or an overlock stitch, or a baby lock, or any number of things that will show how your garment is finished, and that is super important for you to be able to communicate the full effect of your design. So not only does your design and your technical flat have to show the silhouette and the various sort of construction aspects of it, but you need to show how it's finished as well. And so it's pretty easy to develop a stitch line, and I'm just going to show you sort of a mock example utilizing this line here. So you can see I have this solid line. If I select it, you'll see it's 1 point wide. And if I just do Command C or Control C for copy and Command V or Control V for paste, I've duplicated it. And with duplicating it, I can now adjust this one to be a dotted line. So if I take my selection tool here and I select the line and I click this box here, which is the stroke panel. If I click this box, you'll see there's going to be a lot of options. So there's going to be the cap, there's going to be the corner, there's going to be a line stroke. And to just quickly explain, the cap is going to define how your path ends. So if you do a rounded cap, that means the end is going to be rounded. If you do a square cap, it means it's going to end bluntly like a square. This can depend on what you need for your design or for your illustration, however you're utilizing Illustrator. But you also have the corner, which is just going to tell you how does it intersect at corners. So for instance, for this example that it shows here, it says, you know, miter join, round join, bevel join. And that's just going to say if you have a right angle, is it going to go straight and make a point, or is it going to curve, or is it going to bevel and be, you know, at an angle? Now, what we actually want to pay attention to here is both the stroke weight and the dashed line box. So if I tick this box here, you can see that it will then, this is just what I was using recently, but if you see here, it says dash and gap, dash gap, dash gap. So you can effectively make this larger. So if I raise the first dash, you'll see that it makes the actual stitch line much wider. But then if I were to, I'm just going to set this to 5 again, but if I were to adjust the gap, it means there's going to be more space in between my stitch lines. So everybody kind of comes to a different standard for dash lines. Some companies have set ones, that way all the flats look the same. It can kind of depend on how you're sketching. I tend to utilize a 3 and a 1.5 or a 2 and a 1 dash gap ratio. And then you want to make sure that your stroke weight is something like a quarter. So you want your stitch lines to be thinner than your solid lines because it will be more clear and it will look better in the long run. And so then now you have something like your stitch line for a top stitch or for hem, you name it. So now we're going to put all these things together and we're going to develop something similar to this pocket. So to do so, we're just going to go back to our rectangle tool and we're going to make a square or something. And I'm just setting this back to default fill and stroke because I just want it to be black and white. So if I draw my shape, I can of course freehand it as we know, or I can hold shift and it will make my square perfectly. So I want it to be relatively the same size as this pocket for example's sake. And I want you to know that this is very bold line right now. This is a almost 3 point, let's just make that 3. This is a 3 point outline and this inside line is 1 point. That is just so it pops more on the page and as an example. But if this was a real pocket that I was drawing to scale on this sketch, I would have it be 1 point or half point or 0.75 point. Either way, that is just why they will look a little bit different in the end. So I have my square. And now the question is, how do I make it look like this? So one quick way to do this is to go over here to what is your pen tool. And if you long press it, you'll see that with the pen tool, there's the add anchor point and delete anchor point tool. I'm just going to click the add anchor point, and what that is going to do is if I click on a path or a line, it's going to drop another point. And with the other point, I can manipulate that to make this little dip here. So I'm just going to eyeball this and say this is approximately center, but you have to make sure you're actually clicking on the shape or on the path itself. And now if I take my direct selection tool and I select this, you can see now that there's this point here that I can now manipulate. Now, if I want to bring this down to make a little divot, I can select it, click it, and if I hold shift, you'll see that it is constraining to a 45-degree angle, like I said earlier. So I think it needs to be moved just a little bit to the right. And then I'm just going to hold shift and drag it down. That way it makes a nice angle. And that looks pretty good for me. So now what I have to do functionally is just create my top stitching, and we're done. There's a couple ways you can go about doing this. Of course, you can utilize the pen tool, which you'll become more familiar with later, and you could freehand draw the inside stitch lines. Again, this is just not going to be very consistent. As you can see, like this is very wide, this is very narrow over here. And since we're using CAD software, we may as well get the full benefit out of it, right? And have it look super clean and very even if it can do that. So one easy way to do that is if you select your shape with your selection tool, and you go Object, Path, and then we click Offset Path. So what that is going to do is it's going to want to draw a new line, or the same shape that I've selected, but either outside of the original shape or inside the original shape. And so with offset, it's saying now if I had this set to 11 points, it's going to be 11 points outside of the original shape, and then it's going to draw that shape for me. Now, I don't want it to be outside, I want it to be inside, so I can either just nudge this down with my arrow keys, or I could just manually write in -5 pt, and if you just toggle the preview, there you go. So I think that maybe is a little too wide, so I'm going to go with -4 pt, and if I click OK, you'll see now I have my shape on the inside here. I'm going to get rid of the fill, because most of the time you don't want your stitch line to have fill, so I'm going to get rid of that. And then I can go up here to our stroke panel, and I can click my dashed line, and I can make sure it is like 2:1 ratio. Or for this example's sake, we can make it a little bit bigger so it looks better. So we're going to do 5 and 2.5. And now we have our stitching. So we obviously, for our construction, we don't want this to be stitched all the way down. If you presented this in a tech pack, and you sent this to a factory, they would send you a pocket that was sewn down on every side. So we want to just make sure that we are going to address that correctly and have the stitching be on the facing here. So we're going to go to what is my friend, the scissors tool, which is underneath the eraser. So if you long hold the eraser tool, you'll get the scissors tool. And you can cut at these points. You can just click these points and it will cut it out and separate that line. Or I'm just doing Command Z to undo what I just did. Or you could just press your direct selection tool and select that part of the path. If you use the direct selection tool and pick a part of the path or side of one shape, you can actually just select that whole line. So I've selected this top line. I'm going to do Command C, and then I'm going to delete, and then I'm going to do Command V. And then now I can just set this and just stretch it out to meet the side while holding Shift. That way the angle stays the same, and then stretching this out so it goes up to the top edge. And there's your pocket. So of course this is a very basic pocket, but this principle basically applies to most parts of your sketch. For instance, the placket here could just be a rectangle. The parts of the collar are just sort of a rounded rectangle shape. The cuffs can be rectangles with modifications. And so utilizing something like the offset path and basic shapes can really create a lot of different design details that you can put across different sketches. You can have it be sort of mix and match. It makes it easier to edit. And that is a huge benefit of working with an Illustrator.